So the relationship between China and Zambia, between Beijing and Lusaka, I mean, at the bilateral level, I think it's quite good. I mean, certainly at the bilateral level, it's quite good. So officially, the relationship is it's very chummy, as one would put it. Not so many issues there. No diplomatic rows that I can think about. No ambassador in either country has been sent back home on that kind of stuff. So the relationship seems to be very good at the formal bilateral level. So is China popular among the Zambian people? I think one way of putting it is that my sense is Zambians are indifferent. So indifference is just something that you don't think about really. So my sense is that Zambians are very indifferent. And I think I've said elsewhere that almost at the margins, almost towards sort of very partial towards the Chinese, but generally very indifferent. I mean, the typical Zambian, when you ask them to give you an opinion of what they think about the Chinese, I mean, they'll have to think a little bit hard to give you an answer to that question, but it's generally indifference. In fact, one evidence for this is that we had an ex-president who, for a long time, ran on an anti-Chinese platform. But it's possibly that didn't give him any steam, that didn't give him any advantage in the political sphere, and then he gave up on this particular strategy and then eventually won the election. So I'm not saying that caused him winning the election, but it just shows you the limits of that kind of strategy insofar as whipping up votes. So the typical Zambian, in my sense, is rather indifferent. I mean, so there have been instances and isolated incidences of fracas between Zambians and Chinese in particular projects, in particular Chinese-owned mines. But these things are sort of like the natural, things that happen when sort of people from different cultures mix sometimes, especially when it comes to doing business. But in general, the typical Zambian is indifferent, is how I would put it. In fact, what's rather striking, and I often say this to folks, is what's rather striking, given the amount of Chinese involvement in certain spheres of the Zambian economy, you would expect to see much more friction. What you tend to see is far less friction than would be predicted by this kind of involvement. I think for the last year or two, what one has tended to see is a lot of falsehoods and mythhoods being peddled around what is now called in the US fake news. There's been a lot of fake news floating around about China. Now, I have no idea what the source of this fake news has been. So there've been a lot of scare stories, for example, about how once about a year or 2 years ago, there was a fake news item about how Zambia had collateralized our power utility company to the Chinese as collateral for debt, which was actually fake because that wasn't really the case. There was also some story about how the Chinese had taken over our national TV station. And so these kinds of fake news items tend to be obviously consumed on the continent and tend to be exaggerated. I mean, we're living in a moment of lots of fake news, and it's a big epidemic, not just in Africa, not just about China and Africa, but generally about many things across the world. So in this kind of environment, I think Zambia became the poster child, really ground zero for this kind of fake news about China's relationship with Africa. And the rest of our colleagues on the continent were consuming this news and then responding likewise. So, I mean, I don't want to easily dismiss what colleagues in Nigeria are wary about, but it's important to put those kinds of thoughts in this broader context of, what's the basis of their concerns. And when one digs deeper, you realize that their concerns are really overblown, and it's mostly sort of coming out of this fake news thing. Yeah.